Hello everyone, my name is Matt, and this video is a part of a webinar series. We're just going to jump right into it, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Alright, sweet! I can get started with the webinar. So I want to say thank you everybody for coming in. We have a bunch of people in here today, it's really exciting. I have an exciting topic to talk about today. It's character, shape, design, and consistency. So I'm going to talk a bit about shape design, and then I'm going to talk a bit about consistency as well. Because this is probably going to be useful for you guys when it comes to creating personal projects, or if you're working like a pipeline with the studio. This is the table of contents, is the outline here. I'm just gonna jump right into it. So the question is why shape design matters. Okay, so understanding how to design and manipulate shapes help us create and explore a wide variety of ideas with clear intent behind it. And this is very important. We want to have clear intentions. Okay, so if you are just going by autopilot and you're just like drawing in general, you're just going to get something general as an outcome, right? But if you are actively studying, or you are exploring stuff and experimenting with a clear intention behind it, you will get something, a result with that in mind, right? So keep that in mind as we're going through this. So through shape alone, we can get an endless variety of character designs, which we can see in the media that we consume. And I'm just using, three examples here. There's endless, so many different variants, but I just wanted to highlight some different variety of shapes that you're seeing. So I think I'm gonna say, I might butcher the name here. It's Jack Zack. I found this on X or on Twitter, and I really like this because it's so bold and it's so the shapes are so geometric. And in comparison to Farah Shanyar, who's a lot more subtle, he's a lot more realistic about things. And then you have Giovannica, who is a little bit more in between these two, staying faithful with like humanoid proportions, but definitely pushing the shapes, right? And there's so many different variants if you start to look online. So what is shape design, right? Shape design is deliberately drawing and manipulating 2D shapes using design principles in a manner that looks visually appealing, recognizable, and communicates the story effectively. All artists play with shape design, whether they do so consciously or not. Okay, so if you're drawing something, you are going to be placing shapes on a piece of paper, on a canvas, and you're going to be building something out of that. You have something very abstract, you just have a circle, and what if I add like two shapes or three shapes here, two for the eyes and one what looks like maybe a mouth. For an outsider, it might look like that. As you as an artist who's creating this, the intention is to try and create a skull, and now it starts to look more like that if we're moving forward here, and we can take these shapes and refine them further to create something realistic. And if we take these elements that you're seeing here, we have the eyes, we have the nose, we have the mouth, and we have like the contours and the silhouette here. We can take those shapes, those identifiers, and push them to create something that looks soft, something that looks sharp and kind of dangerous, or something that looks a little bit robotic, right? So by modifying, adding, removing, or changing shapes, we can create a wide variety of designs from a simple idea, in this case, a skull. And I want to talk about the 2D mindset. Okay, so when drawing, we often aim to create a sense of three-dimensionality. However, it's important to stay conscious of the actual two-dimensional shapes we manipulate on the canvas, as they help communicate the idea in a clear and appealing way. This way of thinking tends to come more naturally to advanced artists than to beginners. And what I mean by that is that when we start out by drawing and we want to create characters, we often try to train ourselves to think with a 3D mindset, making things look like it has volume, looking at like it exists in a space. But we sometimes forget how to compose these shapes in a manner that looks appealing, and sometimes we have to think with a little bit more of a 2D mindset, which we'll get into in a bit. So since we're drawing on a two-dimensional surface, we are always thinking about how we can draw and organize shapes on the page to create something, whether that is a person, vehicle, prop, or something abstract, right? So those shapes that we are creating, the shapes alone is like abstract, but we put them together and it starts to look like something. We recognize it as something that we have seen before, but it's going to be on a 2D surface. Okay, so we can switch between a 3D mindset and a 2D mindset for this reason. So when drawing, we can switch between a 3D mindset and a 2D mindset. A 3D mindset considers form and perspective, making objects feel three-dimensional and spatially accurate. A 2D mindset focuses on the flat shapes themselves and how they are arranged, structured, and composed on the canvas. So what I like to do a lot if I'm starting out with like a character, does it actually read with the silhouette, right? I tend to cut certain parts of the body up into like chunks, for example. So we have, for example, the head, the body, the legs. If the legs reads nicely, if like the hands read nicely somewhat, if you have, for example, like the scythe, and if that reads really nicely in just like 2D shapes and just as like a silhouette like you're seeing here, and if adding more shapes, right? Then we can make sense of like the 3D aspect of it, and we can switch between them as we're working. Sometimes we're more technical and we want to make sure that we're correct, but other times we want to go back into that 2D mindset and kind of flatten things, so we make sure that it's like really readable and it looks good, and that we can kind of figure out how we can kind of compose those shapes on the canvas. So we have shape design versus shape language here. So there's a difference between the two. I know that there's a lot of people and even professionals that say that shape design and shape language is the same thing, which it's not. They're two different things, but they work hand in hand. Okay, so shape design is using design principles to create and modify shapes. So that can be things like movement, proportions, hierarchy, repetition, etc. Whilst shape language is what the shapes communicate to the audience. So if you have designed shapes or whatnot, you can create a sense of like shape language. So if you look at this star, you know, this star is composed of different shapes together. It can be modified and cut. You know, these are like the triangles that make up the star, and it's just a regular star, but we can modify it to make it feel like it's sharp. And why is it sharp? Well, it feels sharp because it has this like pointed edges right here. We just feel that way. That's the way it communicates to us. Versus something that's soft. This feels soft because it has these like rounded edges, right? So we can use shape design to build something with it, and we use shape language to have like a visual cohesiveness throughout the piece, and will tell us a lot about the character that we're building. Okay, so look at the power of shape. By looking at a familiar character like the Hulk, we can see various interpretations of his design, each offering a different feel and look. We're all familiar with like the new game that came out, Marvel Rivals, and that was like a very cool and interesting take on Hulk, right? And he has different types of shapes on him, which gives us like a different shape language. This one's way more angular and sharp compared to like the more classical that we're a little bit more familiar with, which is a bit more rounded and organic, especially considering the fact that he is pure muscle and you see a lot of muscle fibers. But here with this one, they're taking those muscles and making a lot more chiseled, you know. If you take something like this here, this is by Sam Nielsen. He designed some of these, and these are really cool as well, because this is a different take as well, where this one's more simple and geometric, and you see the internal shapes as well, which makes it look like it's been sculpted or something out of clay. It's very, very beautiful. Versus this one here again, which is still also stylized and boxy, but it doesn't have that like edginess or sharpness like this one. And of course we have to take into consideration the proportions between the two. So a familiar character that we are aware of, just playing around with the shapes has like a huge influence on the overall look and feel, even if they can be somewhat subtle as well. So I'm obviously going to be talking about shape design in games, because we're going to see so much diversity in games that we consume, right? So shape design is very important in games, and we can see a huge amount of diversity from realistic to highly stylized and push shapes. Great shape design helps with readability, identification, appeal, tone, and more, right? So one of the things we need to take into consideration is consistency, especially if you're going to be building a project in games. They have to have some sort of visual consistency through it. So shape design and shape language work hand in hand, like I mentioned earlier, in a project, helping to establish a visual language that should remain consistent throughout the pipeline. So this is Hollow Knight, and I thought this was a decent example. I'm going to show others as well, but if you look at like the silhouette, you will see that this is like the main character. You can see very clearly in the silhouette. If we just look at the character itself, we can pick it apart and we can look at like the shape ingredients, so to speak. So the individual shapes, if we cut them out and see, this looks like it's a part of like the Hollow Knight shape language. You have like the very simple eyes, you have the weapon is also very simple. A lot of things are very simple and very readable here. And then we have visual identity and consistency. The shapes that you are applying onto, for example, enemies or other characters that will come across, they should feel like they fit together with this character as well. So they all feel like they fit together in the same world. Studios sometimes create an art bible or a style guide to maintain a consistent visual style throughout a project, okay? And I say sometimes, they won't always have this case. So if you guys are starting out and you're working for a company or studio, they may have an art bible, especially during the production. In pre-production, maybe not so much so, because they're just exploring the visuals, but in production, they will generally have some sort of art bible or a style guide to follow. So this guide outlines key design principles like shape language, proportions, and rendering styles, ensuring all artwork aligns with the intended aesthetic. It includes visual examples, do's and don'ts, and breakdowns of common design elements. By following these guidelines, artists can keep characters, environments, and props cohesive even across a large team. And I'm just showcasing just some examples of how some of these looks like. Basically style guides or some sort of like step-by-step of how to build something. Okay, so I saw this one here. This is for animation specifically. I don't know which one it is. It might be something from like Looney Tunes, and you can see how, for example, these characters should be built in order to feel like they're working in that animation. So they all feel like, okay, you have this bunny character, and you have this like duck character, and you have this like mouse looking character, and they all feel like they fit together in the same world, right? Now I'm going to get into shape language consistency, and I'm going to use Super Mario as example number 1. So Super Mario as a franchise has a very rounded and friendly shape language that remains consistent even with its enemies. When I say even with its enemies, is that we see the good guys here, but you see the enemies that also are supposed to be like, okay, these guys are mean, these guys are like the good guys. Even the mean character has like shape language that feels like it isn't too different from the others in terms of it has these like rounded shapes. Even the spikes are a little bit rounded and whatnot, right? The game prioritizes clear, simple shapes, making characters easily recognizable even on a small screen like a Game Boy. That's like how Super Mario was initially built. So if I were to look at these from a distance, I can see it very clearly. And just in the silhouette alone, we can see that, yeah, they just pop out. I know that this is Luigi here, this is Princess Peach, this is Toadette here, this is Bowser. And if I just like highlight some of the shapes and I just break it down, like they use a ton of circles. A lot of the limbs are really thick. A lot of like the hands here are like quite blobby. This is the spikes I'm highlighting here. So even the spikes, they don't feel super sharp or really aggressive in a way. And this kind of makes sense, especially if the target audience is going to be for kids or toddlers, right? But you know, even adults enjoy this like visual aesthetic as well, because it's just very visually appealing, right? And here we can see the big, medium, and small breakdown of the shapes internally as well. So if you break down the shape of the hat, the eyes, the nose, and all that, the ratios between like the bigs, the mediums, and smalls isn't too crazy, and they're not detailed. And that makes these characters even more recognizable and easy to remember. And if you ask me to like draw these characters without looking at the reference, I could do so fairly easily, you know. If you give me like a few retries and whatnot, I could like memorize these characters very, very easily. Now let's look at Gigantic, which is a different game. So Gigantic features a bold and dynamic shape language that emphasizes exaggerated proportions and strong silhouettes, making characters easily recognizable even in fast-paced third-person combat. The game prioritizes sharp edges and flowing curves, creating a strong contrast to Super Mario's soft, rounded shapes. So we can see that immediately here. let's just highlight the silhouettes, because that's going to make things a little bit easier to isolate it, so we can like look at it in just like 2D shapes much more obviously. We can see immediately, yeah, there's a lot more triangles and such going on. There's a lot more things sticking out of the bodies, and the limbs and whatnot, they're not as like chubby. They're very willing to go from like big to small very quickly in comparison to Super Mario. So they have a different language going on right there. If we see the big, mediums, and smalls, the ratios are a little bit more extreme. We can see that the mediums are a bit smaller and that the smalls are even like tinier, and they litter them around even more, right? So each project has a unique shape language. Like spoken languages, it follows built-in rules and structures that should be respected. For example, Japanese and English differ in structure, symbols, and phonetics, so hearing clear English words in Japanese or vice versa would feel out of place, right? So if I'm like, for example, speaking Norwegian right now, så hvis jeg snakker norsk akkurat nå, så høres det veldig rart ut. For at nå det helt annet språk, og dere forstår ikke hva jeg sier, og det helt annerledes fra engelsk. Okay, so that was a little bit of Norwegian. That feels very different from English, and you guys like, oh whoa, that's a contrast right there. And I would say, you know, Japanese is even more different than English, because English and Norwegian has a Germanic background to it, so it's a Germanic language. There are some similarities, but Japanese is even more. So if there's like English, like you were speaking English, and then suddenly there was like one Japanese word with perfect Japanese accent and dialect, you know, it would sound really out of place because it doesn't fit in the English language naturally, right? And the same thing, you know, can happen in games as well. So similarly, Luigi's shape language from Super Mario wouldn't fit naturally in the world of Gigantic. So if you just placed Luigi, if I go back, in here somewhere, it would be kind of like, what is he doing there, right? So just like highlighting, Gigantic is sharp and dynamic, it's more detailed, it has a bit more like semi-realistic proportions, whilst, you know, if you look at Super Mario, it's more soft and rounded, it's more simple, and has more childish proportions. So that's like an analysis and a difference between these two that we can see, right? Now, I want to talk about a little bit about shape and complexity as well that we need to take into consideration. So it's the level of detail and complexity in a project. So some projects maintain a simple and readable shape language, while others focus on intricate details for added visual interest. And simple does not mean bad, guys. Okay, so some people might look at like something that's very complex, and it's like, whoa, there's lots of detail there. That's much more interesting. Yes, it can be very interesting, but simple stuff as well has its value. I really enjoy playing a bit of Super Meat Boy. If you guys haven't played before, I recommend checking it out. I think there's definitely it's a free game that you can play online. And it's very recognizable, and it makes it very easy to kind of follow along with the game because it has a purpose. This is not random, okay? Versus something like Monster Hunter here. Monster Hunter is a lot more complexity, and you can see how the silhouette is like super crazy, way more noisy than say something like Gigantic or Super Mario. Like even though Gigantic has a bit more of that wibbly wobbliness going on in the silhouette, Monster Hunter has that way more, and it can be a little bit hard to identify certain things. Now, obviously, if you were to not look at the silhouette, but also just look at the internal shapes, things would be different, and then you have things such as color as well. But if you're just looking at shapes, some of the things that Monster Hunter is helping a lot, especially since Monster Hunter is a high-paced, high-intensity game, they really like to use huge weapons as a way to identify the characters and their role. So this could be like this is like a warrior type of character that uses like a great sword or something. I think that's what it is. Then we have project consistency. So now we're going to get into like an example of my own project, right? So when starting a project with multiple characters, create a few sketches and compare your best pieces side by side to see if they fit together. Consider factors like scale as well. And what I mean by scale is like the size differences between the characters, because sometimes we have a tendency to draw the characters in a different like layer and not compare them, and then you realize that the scale between the shapes of one character doesn't really match with like a larger character, because like which I will get into in a little bit. But continuing on, my plan for this project was to have two opposing factions Characters within each faction should feel like they belong together, but both factions must still look like they exist in the same world visually. So we have the red faction and the green faction here, but like the red factions should feel like they fit together more, but the green faction should feel like they're still inhabiting this like world that I'm kind of conjuring up for this project. When refining, pay attention to the shapes used in your drawing or painting. Identify them and reuse them across different characters. If we take the time to look closely, we can spot several shapes shared between the two, right? So just like I talked about earlier, if you're designing a character, you're designing some shapes, you're now starting to develop some sort of shape language, and that shape language will be basically the parent of the whole project that we need to keep consistent. That shape languages that you're using, for example, in this case, I like to use very sharp edges, and I love triangles. I love triangular shapes in my projects. I tend to reuse it a lot, so that tends to be like the consistent parent shape that I am reusing throughout my projects here. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the scale, right? So when you look at this character scaled up, this small one here, if you have it side by side with this big guy, you can see like the ratios between the shapes doesn't really match up with this guy. But if we scale it down, now the ratios makes a little bit more sense now, because like if you look at like the number of spikes here and the number of spikes here on the belt here, they kind of make sense in terms of like the size and scale, so they don't feel out of place, right? So I have to take into consideration the fact that this character is smaller, the ratios between the shapes is going to be different with like a much larger character. Okay, so I'm just going to highlight some parts that I looked at to compare between the character while I'm trying to maintain a somewhat similar shape language between the two. So I'm looking at things like the hair. If you look at like the way that I've designed the shape of the hair shape language here is consistent with the shape language in the hair with the hair here. Then you also have like the V shape of the metal that is for example, on her head is also the same as a belt element on the big guy. The spikes as well is something that I'm reusing here just for the sake of consistency's sake. And they are the same faction, so I'm reusing a lot of elements. And the same thing goes for like the chains or like the scales that's hanging below them. So if you're looking at the contours as well, the way that I'm dealing with the contours, a lot of it has these like sharp edges, like I pointed out earlier. And I don't use that many like soft circles in a lot of places. Even the more like circle elements tend to be more elliptical. So I like to play around with movement and gesture quite a bit with my project. And that's what I personally enjoy. Okay, so when drawing several characters for a project, check for inconsistencies. A good method is to compare the silhouettes and see how they align with one another. Okay, so this is like, I initially started with this guy, this lion guy, and then afterwards I continued with the project and started making this hunter. And I had to make sure that there were some elements that are familiar between these two. Now they don't have as many similarities in like the internal shapes, like the shoulder pad here. It's not the same as like what this guy is wearing. But there are some other similarities in terms of like the contours, like the head element here. It's like the shapes are being kind of similar here. In terms of proportions, the way that I'm dealing with the limbs is also kind of similar. The way that I'm stylizing the hands is similar to how I'm stylizing the hands over here. So if you look at the silhouette here, we can compare between these two, and we shall see that the amount of detail and the amount of like complexity and all that, they should kind of be synonymous with one another. Okay, so one shouldn't look like Luigi and one shouldn't look like the character that we saw from Gigantic, right? We don't want that huge difference in terms of like the visual language there. Okay, so if you trust the process and maintain a good quality throughout, the final outcome will be consistent, making all the characters feel cohesive. Consider factors like coloring and the level of rendering as well. Okay, so this is like the final outcome of the project that I've made, and of course there are other elements that I'm trying to keep like visually consistent, like I mentioned, the coloring and the rendering, but just focusing on just the shape alone, it can help tremendously, guys. And if you take the time to analyze other artists and see how they deal with it, and then applying, kind of like taking some of their their visual language, or kind of like experimenting on your own and trying that on your own projects, you can get some really interesting results. So by analyzing, breaking it down, and then trying it for yourself, you will learn a lot by going through this type of process, right? Before I end the presentation, I want to do a bit of a course recommendation. If you enjoy designing characters, if you like the idea of it at least, I do have a course called Character Design for Video Games. I highly recommend checking that out. If you want to know more about designing, I highly recommend checking out Hugh Teo's Design Foundations 2, which is more of an advanced design course. And if you want to actually get better at painting, you know, I talked about shape and contours and silhouettes, not really about painting here. But if you want to get better at painting and kind of like paint your characters or paint your scenes, I highly recommend checking out Axel Sarwald's Digital Painting Basics. And that is it for my presentation. And like I said, guys, if you have any questions, we can move on to the Q&A. Alright, so that is the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to like and subscribe. Remember that we have a website with our courses, so I recommend checking that out. We also have a Discord community. The links will be in the description down below. Remember, the Discord is free, so you can join at any time. I'll see you guys around next time. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.